Rabbi Ben Tov was a scholarly and learned man, one much respected, not just because of his long flowing gray beard, which made him appear wise, but because he truly knew the scriptures. He was a fair and honest man, but one who always wanted proof. If someone were to imply that the scriptures spoke to a certain matter, he would pull out his Torah and ask that they show him exactly where. If someone said the law permitted a certain act, he would ask to see the specific law. He was a very precise man and would never commit himself to any cause unless he was absolutely sure of it. And so he treated Jesus. He had heard much about this young rabbi, and even though he had come from the hick town of Nazareth, Jesus' wisdom was greatly preceding him. He had heard stories of the miraculous healings and even of the raising of the dead. But it would take more than stories to convince Rabbi Ben Tov. That's why he looked forward to meeting Jesus. One day, as he was walking through the streets of Jerusalem, Rabbi Ben Tov heard a huge commotion going on just outside the city gates. As he moved slowly along with the great crowd of people, he learned that Jesus was entering the city. There was much excitement in the air. Soon, Ben Tov found himself caught up in the excitement of the moment, and he too was laying palm branches down in the road before Jesus' donkey, and in hopes of catching a glimpse of Jesus as he passed by. Just as he maneuvered into a position where he could see, a stinging pain shot up his thumb. A splinter from one of the coarse palms had lodged itself in his thumb. He looked and saw the sliver sticking out of his thumb and winced in pain as he removed it. Placing his thumb in his mouth to soothe the smarting, he glanced up only to see the tail end of the donkey. Jesus had already passed by, and the crowd was closing in around him. Disappointed at the missed opportunity, he thought to himself, "I'll see him teaching in the synagogue tomorrow. That will be soon enough." And so Ben Tov rose early the next morning and said his prayers, but all during his prayers he found himself continually picking at the little flap of skin left from the day before. This, of course, hurt, but he just couldn't leave it alone. By the time he had finished his prayers and eaten his breakfast, his thumb was throbbing once again. "Perhaps," he said to his wife, "I'll see Jesus tomorrow. I'll just rest today and soak my thumb." The next day found Ben Tov very busy, and so it wasn't until Wednesday that he started searching for Jesus. But Jerusalem was very busy because of the feast, and by the time he would get to where Jesus was said to have been, Jesus would be gone. All day Wednesday, he was one step behind Jesus. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, he found Jesus and actually got close enough to ask Jesus a question. Clearing his throat, "Ahem," Ben Tov said, "Rabbi, may I ask a question?" Jesus turned toward him and smiled and nodded his head. "Rabbi," he continued, "how will I know when the Messiah has come so that I might worship him?" Jesus' eyes lit up at the question, and he began to speak. But at that very moment, Ben Tov placed his hands into his pockets, and the little flap of skin on his thumb pulled back. The pain ran up his arm all the way to his elbow. He jerked his hand out of his pocket and looked to see if he had done any more damage to it. Upon examining it closely, he saw that he hadn't, but as he directed his attention back to Jesus, Jesus was already busy answering another question. Dejected and cursing his thumb, Ben Tov left thinking, "Tomorrow I'll explain to Jesus what happened and ask him again." Ben Tov spent all morning Friday and a good part of the afternoon trying to find Jesus. Then he learned what happened the night before, how Jesus was captured, praying in the garden, and then questioned all night long, and that he had been severely beaten and sent to be executed as a common criminal. He raced to where Jesus was dying on the cross. Ben Tov was angry at the Romans for such a cruel form of execution. He was angry at himself for not having a chance to speak with Jesus. He was angry that a stupid little cut made him miss his opportunity to learn from Jesus. In fact, he was so angry that he stood off to the side, muttering to himself, complaining about his thumb and the trouble it had caused. He was so distracted again by his thumb, this time by his anger at it, that he never once looked up at Jesus to see what Jesus was doing for him on the cross and how he was suffering for Ben Tov's sins. As the day drew to a close, he found himself still distracted by his sore thumb, never noticing that Jesus had died and been taken down from the cross. Several days later, Ben Tov's thumb felt much better, and he began to hear stories about Jesus and the empty tomb. But he dismissed them as rumors. It will take more than stories to convince me, he thought to himself. Besides, I didn't see anything special in him. It's amazing to me that there is so much confusion about the resurrection. All kinds of people debating whether or not Jesus really did rise from the grave. Even Christian theologians debate what really happened that day outside Jerusalem. And pastors preach from their pulpits their own theories because they find the traditional doctrine boring or old hat. One professor put it right, I think. The proof is in the people living today who have experienced the risen Lord in their own lives. The proof of the resurrection is not in archaeological evidence painstakingly dug up and laid out carefully so that the entire scientific and cynical world can observe and believe. The proof of the resurrection is in the lives of those who believe. You can go to the Holy Land and ask to see the tomb where Jesus was laid, and each tour guide will take you to a different tomb. And guess what? Jesus won't be in any of them. But ask a believer who has met the risen Lord, and they'll tell you about how Jesus has transformed their life. They'll tell you about how their life was before Christ and how it is now that Jesus has filled them. And if they've always believed, they'll tell you how the Lord has walked with them and guided them through the various times in their life. And if you are still unconvinced that Jesus really did rise, ask God. The morning after the time change, as I took my morning walk, I heard a bird singing. It was pitch black, as only it is just before the dawn, and I was tired and groggy, not exactly raring to go. But this bird was just singing away, as though he knew something I didn't, as though she knew that the darkness would not last, as though the bird knew that the dawn was coming. Tagore wrote, "Faith is the bird that feels the light and sings while the dawn is still dark." That's what faith is. The truth may not be obvious to others, but to those who have faith, it is as obvious as the coming dawn. At the tomb of Jesus, early that first Easter morning, I'll bet it was very quiet. There weren't any angelic choirs singing or trumpets blaring out the good news. The events of the preceding day probably hung like a heavy fog as the women walked to the tomb. But I'll bet, even then, there was a bird singing. The glory of Easter is often hidden from the eyes of those who choose not to believe. Even if it could be proven scientifically, some would not believe. Remember the Flat Earth Society? Some persist in believing that smoking is not harmful to your health, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Rabbi Ben Tov would not believe unless he had documented proof, but then he couldn't be still long enough to see the documentation happening all around him. The truth is a matter of faith. not clinical studies. And when the truth dawns on the hearts of people, the universe begins to make some sense. The questions of life take on a new perspective, and it's like finding out the name of the song that you have been singing all your life, which then becomes your favorite song. May God bless us as we ponder the reality of the resurrection this day. Now let us spend some time prayerfully considering.